Notionally, we are back to where we were a
Square
month
one,
ago,
yeah.
or we were supposed to be a month ago in terms of clarity on what China's going to do with rare earth exports and in particular rare earth magnets in return for the United States essentially seeming to walk back many of the export controls and other restrictions that it put in place after Geneva to build leverage for these talks. But I do think we're a little bit far away from what the president's claiming in terms of a full deal with China. That remains very much outstanding. Tariff levels don't appear to have been adjusted in London, and we're still facing this August deadline of reaching that larger deal before higher tariff rates come back into place.
Mm-hmm. How much friction does there appear to be right now? Are we moving at all any closer to a point of consensus?
I think at the moment tensions have come off the front boiler, but they're still very much on the back burner, and they could rise again at any point, particularly if there continue to be disagreements about what exactly was agreed to, or we continue to see any sort of supply disruptions in terms of critical minerals and other key exports from China. And then again, the entire looming deadline is really more about tariffs, which they don't seem to have discussed in London. And I think that's going to be an even stickier set of issues to address. China now realizes they have this major hammer in the form of these critical mineral export controls that they can leverage. And I think that really dilutes the U.S. ability to push China towards the deal that Washington says it wants.
I want to ask you a little bit more about that. I'm going to paraphrase something from our colleague Sean Donnan in the D.C. Bureau who covers trade. I'm going to botch this, but I think the thrust of it was the longer you go, time kind of evaporates the efficacy of the leverage that you've got. And so, yes, there's this leverage when it comes to the rare earth minerals, but the longer this gets attenuated, the longer these talks go on, the closer we get to this deadline for this 90-day pause. So where does that leave the U.S.? Where is its leverage, as you see it in these talks, in these negotiations?
Certainly never going to disagree with Sean.
Never.
I will say I
Good
think the
counsel
time
for everyone.
Exactly. I think the timelines here are slightly different. The amount of time it would take the United States to build up independent supply chains for critical minerals and rare earths is more a question of years, whereas these negotiations, I think the U.S. would prefer to wrap up, if not by August, within several months time frame, right? So I think in terms of leverage, China's going to maintain that pain point for at least the near term. Now, the United States is trying to take steps to diversify its critical minerals dependencies, but it's been trying to do that for over a decade at this point, and it would take some really serious investments in order to accomplish that.
So, of course, we know China is a major trading partner here with the U.S. And, of course, we talked about some of these rare materials. But what exports in particular are economists really keeping their eye on in terms of broader clarity on tariffs?
I think the key question is going to be with tariffs now at still very high levels. They brought them back down from their peak in April, but they're still, U.S. tariff rate is around 40% on China. Chinese tariff rate on the U.S. is upwards of 20% when you take into account tariffs that existed before Trump came back into the White House. We think that's going to take U.S.-China trade down by about 70%. And so we're still likely to see some shortages. We're still likely to see price hikes. The key question is going to be, how does that impact supply chains in terms of, is that price point too high where you don't just see higher price tags on the shelves, but you actually see things missing on the shelves because it just doesn't make economic sense for people to bring it in.
I'm old enough to remember when a chief, if not the chief motivator for these talks, this disagreement had to do with fentanyl and China exporting the ingredients for it to the U.S. and the wider world. Where does that stand? I mean, this has grown larger than that in terms of what the motivations are. But it seems to me, as I've been reading in since these talks have taken place, that's not something where we've seen much movement from the Chinese.
It's a great question. And it wasn't that far back. It was back in February and March when
felt much younger then. Yeah.
Exactly. No, I think that those remain U.S. concerns, but they have very much faded into the backdrop. And I think that just adds to the list of complex topics for all these negotiations. It's trade and economic practices. Currency might be on the table. This was also not addressed, but just last week, Treasury released a report on currency practices where they called out China for what they felt like was not a full manipulation, but concerning practices. Now, we're adding supply chain risk to the table. And then, yes, there's fentanyl, which remains very much an outstanding issue in the relationship.